Well, we take a look now at what the Labour Party's victory means for the Rwandan Asylum deal and other matters. And we're joined now by a Professor of History and Policy at the University of Westminster, Professor Pippa Catterall, and former Commissioner of the UK Electorate Peter Wardle. Good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us here on Channel 405. I think, Prof. Catterall, I want to start with you. This is one of the reviews, of course, that's come in from some that have been watching this election very, very closely this week. Third Way, which is a centrist American think tank, having watched this election this week, said that they've described the results as a victory for ruthless competence. They say that this is not a story of Britain lurching to the left. This is a story about something deeper, about broken promises and broken trust. But what they've done as well is really compare the balance of power between centrist to far left and far right, certainly in the UK, and what it means for relations with countries like the UK, like the US, for instance, where the battle between Donald Trump and Biden is still, of course, cooking up in the run-up to their election. What do you make about the lesson that this election has taught us about the leaning towards the left, if you will, for the UK?
Well, I would agree with the think tank that you've just cited. This was an election that Keir Starmer only really had to avoid making major mistakes to win. And he succeeded in doing that. The Labour vote drifted down during the campaign a little bit, and they ended up on about 35% of the vote, and still winning a massive majority. Essentially, the Conservative Party, the incumbent party, lost it through a record of chaos and total incompetence on so many issues, as you've just heard from the various interviewees you've had over the last 14 years. So promising, as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer did, that change is stability is change after the chaos of the last few years, after crashing the economy, after creating a situation where Britain has the highest energy prices in Europe and the lowest food security in Europe, anything would feel better. And you look at some of it, and it's surprising that the Conservatives continue to win much support at all. So I don't think it's a lurch to the left or anything like that. It's a vote for competence and stability, and that's what Keir Starmer promised.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I'm going to bring you in, Mr. Peter Wardle here. Of course, you're former commissioner with the UK Electoral Commission, which says you've obviously been watching elections in the UK for a very long time, and this is certainly one of the more decisive elections that we've seen in the UK for quite some time, with this very clear victory for the Labour Party. Talk to me about this, what the message is that is being sent by the voters in this election, certainly around immigration and what they want to see. I mean, you really can't speak about this election without mentioning the multi-million-pound plan to send migrants to Rwanda. In the run-up to the election, some analysts would have seen that one of the third most important points or issues that have been raised by voters in the UK has been immigration.
Yes, I've been watching elections for a long time. Generally, I'd agree with Pippa. I think what was essentially happening here was a vote for a competent government by a population which had been watching an incompetent government. Rwanda is off the table as of this morning. I think it's been confirmed that by the new Prime Minister, as he said in the run-up to the election, that he never thought that the Rwanda scheme would work, that it would deliver the right sort of deterrent to people who were trying to get into the UK, and he seems to me to be taking a more strategic view, a more thought-through view, and in particular, more cooperation with neighbouring countries in Europe from where immigrants are coming. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. But the immediate news this morning is that he's confirmed what he said in the run-up to the polls, which is that the Rwanda scheme is not going to go ahead under his prime ministership. As far as the question of immigration generally is concerned, with our system, there are no prizes for coming second in constituencies. So although there's quite a lot of comment about the fact that a party called Reform UK, which was probably the strongest on anti-immigration, secured quite a high share of the vote, He'd only secured 5 seats in the parliament. And it's not, I don't think, going to have a great influence on any policy over the next 5 years while the Labour Party is in government.
Yeah.
There is some speculation that reform may feature in 5 years' time at the next election, but there's an awful lot of ifs and buts involved in there. And this particular party has collapsed more than once in the past. So whether it can make it through for 5 years remains to be seen.
Yeah, that was swift movement there by the new Prime Minister. And Prof. Pippa, Catterall, if I can come back to you, because obviously what we've seen here in South Africa is our very own president saying that he welcomes, the opportunity to work with the new Prime Minister of the UK, which is obviously quite interesting, talking about how the two countries share broad similarities and commitment to democracy. I'm interested in the sort of policy direction that we're likely to see Prime Minister Starmer take where foreign relations is concerned, where we've seen South Africa quite emphatically going to the ICJ in support of Palestine and calling the war in Gaza a potential genocide, right? Where does that place South Africa's relationship with Keir Starmer and his position on the war in the Middle East?
Well, absolutely. I just start off by reflecting that the shift in immigration policy should help relations with countries around the world, not least because it will change the way in which you've had a hostile environment to students coming from overseas and so on. And the vast majority of immigrants coming into the UK are legitimate rather than refugees, although bizarrely the Conservatives have concentrated on this tiny portion of people coming in on criminal through criminal gangs on small boats. In terms of Gaza, Labour's manifesto stressed that they support an immediate ceasefire. That doesn't mean that they'll be able to enforce it, but they will at least have a tougher line towards Netanyahu and the kinds of behaviour that the Israeli Defence Force has been conducting in Gaza than the preceding Conservative government. The stance may not be as strong as that taken by South Africa and actually calling it genocide, but I think it's going to be a much more robust one. More broadly, there's not actually that much in the Labour manifesto on foreign policy, and a lot of it is focused upon climate change and the idea of providing some kind of leadership, could be clearer on this, in terms of international actions to implement the proceedings of COP26 and so on. And I'm sure those are the kinds of things that Labour will be looking towards. They'll also no doubt see South Africa as a major partner within Africa in general and as a major strategic partner in a world in which threats are increasing. So I'm sure that Starmer will be looking to develop good links there. He's appointed in David Lammy a new Foreign Secretary who's been in post as the shadow Foreign Secretary for a number of years now, has developed good links with a number of people around the world, including with African leaders. And I'm sure Lammy is very clear about the importance of the relationship between Britain and major partners like South Africa in the coming years.
Yeah. Peter, I'm going to bring you in here just as we wrap up the discussion, because I'm interested in a little bit more of a broader view from your end, right? This idea that the voter of this era is a different one. And let me put the idea forward and get your thoughts on it. There's, for instance, here in South Africa, we've just come out of elections where a party that has been governing the country for 30 years has lost a significant amount of power coming in at this election, that being the ANC at just above 40% and needing to share power with the opposition as it forms this new government of national unity. And then, of course, you look at examples coming out of the US as they hurtle towards their November election. And there's, this expectation that those perhaps that previously would have voted for the Democrats may be leaning towards the Republicans, depending on, how you look at it. What do you make about the quality of democracy that we're seeing being formed globally, and perhaps with some of the big elections that we see taking place this year? The lesson that voters certainly are showing politicians. I get the sense that there's less of a commitment to party ideals, but there is more of a commitment to delivery.
Well, I think you're right. I think voters are changing. Voters' motivations are changing. And South Africa's a really interesting example, because for many years it was unthinkable for people to step away from the ANC, the party that was associated with the liberation movement. And it took many years for South Africa to reach the point which you've reached now, where other factors are coming much more strongly into voters' minds. Mm. It's absolutely the case in Britain that voters are much less likely to be voting for the same party throughout their life, to be voting for the same party their parents voted for, be voting for the same party that everyone else in their town or village votes for. That was the case, 50, 60 years ago. But nowadays, people are very willing to change their allegiance between the elections. And the difference between the 2019 and the 2024 elections in the UK absolutely demonstrates that, massive switch. Yeah. From a strong majority for the Conservative Party to a landslide majority for the Labour Party. Yeah. And as Pippa said right at the beginning, largely down to the way in which the Conservatives squandered their support that they've been given previously. The US, I find much more difficult to understand, to be quite honest, because there does seem to be a much greater element of tribalism and people voting for particularly former President Trump, almost come what may. And I think a lot of us are surprised to see, all the things that Trump is said or found to have done wrong, yeah. And yet people don't seem to care. So, it does vary according to culture, yeah. History and politics.
Oh, you can